When I arrived at my lakeside property and found my cabin reduced to rubble, I thought it was a horrible mistake. But when a construction worker told me the HOA ordered it on land I own, I knew this wasn't just careless. It was war. What they didn't realize? I also own the land under their $1 million clubhouse, and I was about to make them pay for every single nail. I couldn't believe my eyes. One quiet Saturday morning, I pulled up to my lakeside property expecting a weekend of peace and fresh air, maybe a little fishing, some time by the fire, and a break from the daily grind. But as I rounded the final curve in the dirt road and stepped out of my truck, my entire body froze. Where my cabin had once stood, the cozy, handcrafted retreat I'd poured 2 summers of sweat and soul into, there was nothing but wreckage. The porch was gone. The walls, leveled, the roof I'd replaced just last year, scattered in splinters across the dirt. Every memory, every moment I'd built into that place, crushed into debris. I just stood there, staring, my mind struggling to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. My first thought? Maybe a storm had torn through. Maybe a tree fell. Maybe vandals destroyed it. But then I noticed the neat rows of orange cones, a clean gravel path that now ran directly through the space where my front door used to be, and a shiny new park bench bolted into the ground. Then came the final punch in the gut, a small construction crew working nearby. One guy was running a compact loader, another was installing decorative lights along the trail. I walked up, trying to stay calm. "Hey," I asked, "what happened to the cabin that was right here?" One of the workers shrugged. "Oh, we cleared that out last week. HOA wanted this trail done by summer, said this section of Shoreline was in the path." I blinked. "The HOA? You mean Lakeside Preserve?" "Yeah," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "They told us this stretch was theirs." That's when it hit me. The HOA, the one I had never joined, the one across the lake, had torn down my cabin. Let me back up. The land had been in my family for decades. My grandfather bought it back in the 1970s, long before the fancy homes and upscale development started popping up across the lake. He wanted peace, nothing more. Just a little stretch of land near the water and a simple cabin where he could fish, read, and escape the noise of the world. When he passed away, he left it to me. A 3-acre slice of heaven with tall trees, a quiet dock, and a small hand-built cabin tucked right into the shoreline. It wasn't big. It didn't have granite countertops or smart thermostats. But it was ours. A place full of history and meaning. A few years ago, I decided to restore it. I spent months driving out every weekend, replacing floorboards, patching up the roof, restaining the wood. Every single board was a labor of love. And now, it was gone. Here's the kicker. My land wraps around the lake in such a way that it includes a big stretch of shoreline, including the area directly in front of the HOA's community clubhouse. They owned the building, the pool, the tennis courts, and the lots behind it, but not the waterfront. That was my land. Always had been, and they knew it. For years, we coexisted without issues. I kept to myself. I didn't complain when their residents got a little noisy on weekends. I didn't fence anything off. I just enjoyed my property and let them enjoy the view. That was apparently a mistake. The HOA had decided to build a scenic walking trail for their residents, a path that would begin at their clubhouse, loop around the lake, and connect back into the neighborhood. It was part of their green space initiative. Nice idea. Except one problem. They didn't own the shoreline they planned to build it on. Instead of reaching out, negotiating, or even asking for temporary access, they just assumed. Or worse, they didn't care. They sent in a crew and bulldozed everything in their way, including my home. No warning, no call, no posted notice, nothing. After the shock wore off, I got mad, really mad. But I didn't scream. I didn't confront anyone that day. I drove straight home, opened my file cabinet, and pulled out everything: the deed, the survey map, the land records going back to 1973. I needed to be absolutely sure before I made my next move, and what I found made my jaw drop. Not only did I still own the full shoreline, including the spot where my cabin had stood, but I also discovered that part of the HOA's clubhouse patio actually extended onto my property. That's right. The very people who had demolished my cabin without permission had unknowingly built their own clubhouse partially on my land years ago. It had gone unnoticed because my grandfather had never raised a fuss. But now, now it was time to raise hell. I hired a real estate attorney the next day. She took one look at the documentation and said, "This isn't just trespassing. This is destruction of property, unlawful construction, and long-term land encroachment." We filed a cease and desist letter first. The HOA ignored it. Then we filed a lawsuit. The case made waves in the county. A small private landowner suing a powerful HOA for demolishing a historic cabin and building on land they didn't own. The local paper even picked up the story. The HOA's legal team tried to spin it, saying it was a mistake, that the records were confusing, and that they were willing to make it right. They offered me a settlement. Want to guess how much? $10,000 for a destroyed cabin, emotional damages, and years of illegal land use. I laughed, and then I rejected it. The case went to court. My documentation was ironclad. We had aerial photos showing before and after damage, satellite data proving the landlines, historical records proving my family's ownership dating back 5 decades. The judge ruled in my favor, unanimously. Here's what the HOA was ordered to do: pay damages for the cabin and the emotional toll, $210,000. Compensate for years of unauthorized use of the land, $160,000. Cover all legal fees. And here's the kicker: they had to either tear down the back of their clubhouse or lease the land from me indefinitely at a monthly rate I got to set. They chose the lease. Today, they pay me $12,000 a month just to keep that back patio. That's right, I'm now their landlord. And as for the walking trail, it ends abruptly at a large black metal gate with a sign that says, "Private property. No trespassing. Do not enter." Every time I visit, I see residents stop at the gate, turn around, and walk back. Some of them glare at me. Others just look away. A few even had the nerve to write me letters asking if I'd reconsider and be neighborly. No thanks. I was neighborly for years. I gave them space. I allowed peace. They repaid it by tearing down my family's legacy without a second thought. Now they pay, every month, just to stand on a piece of ground they once thought was theirs. I rebuilt the cabin, by the way. Took me another 2 summers. This time, with better insulation, solar power, and a wraparound deck that faces the lake and the clubhouse. I sit there sometimes with a cup of coffee, watching their events take place on a deck that legally belongs to me, smiling every time the rent check clears, because sometimes the best revenge is quiet, legal, and paid monthly. Let me back up. I inherited my lakeside property from my grandfather, a man who valued peace, quiet, and independence. It wasn't a mansion or some sprawling estate, just a narrow stretch of shoreline with about 3 wooded acres and a small, hand-built cabin. But it was ours. He bought it in the early 1970s, back when the lake was still wild, undeveloped, and serene. No neighbors, no gates, just water, trees, and open sky. He built that cabin with his own hands, simple, sturdy, and filled with character. It had no fancy appliances, no central air, and no internet, but it was the kind of place that made you breathe easier the second you stepped inside. As a kid, I spent summers there fishing, helping split wood, and listening to him tell stories on the porch until the stars came out. When he passed away, the cabin and the land came to me. I didn't just inherit property, I inherited history, legacy, roots, and I swore I'd protect it. Fast forward to today, and everything around that little patch of land has changed. What used to be wild forest was now a luxury gated community called Lakeside Preserve. They built big modern homes with shiny SUVs in the driveways and trimmed lawns stretching right up to the tree line. Then came the clubhouse, tennis courts, a pool, and even private docks on the water. But here's the thing. They didn't own the shoreline. That's what no one seemed to realize. My grandfather had purchased smart. His land wrapped around the lake's edge in such a way that, although the HOA owned the homes and facilities behind the water, I owned a critical stretch of shoreline, including the land right in front of their beloved clubhouse. At first, it didn't matter. For years, we coexisted without issue. I kept to myself. I didn't use their amenities, and they didn't bother me. They hosted barbecues, weddings, and weekend events at the clubhouse, and I didn't complain, even when the music got loud. It was fine. I respected their space, and I assumed they'd respect mine. That assumption, it turns out, was a huge mistake. Apparently, the HOA had this grand idea. They wanted to create a lakeside walking trail, a beautiful path that started at the clubhouse, followed the water's edge, and looped back into the neighborhood. Good for residents, great for home values. They called it an investment in community wellness. The problem? That trail would cut directly through my land. Now you'd think they would have knocked on my door, sent a letter, made a phone call, offered to buy an easement, maybe even just ask politely for access. They didn't do any of that. One day, without a word, they rolled in with heavy machinery and started clearing trees. They bulldozed the brush. They dropped gravel. They installed signs. And right in the middle of that destruction zone was my cabin, my home, my grandfather's home, a place that had stood for nearly 50 years, torn down without notice, without permission, without even the decency of a conversation. When I showed up that morning and saw it, just debris and dirt where my cabin used to be, I was speechless. At first, I thought maybe a tree fell during a storm. But then I saw the walking trail already halfway built, winding right through where my front porch once stood, as if my cabin had never existed. And that's when I started asking questions. I approached the crew working near the shoreline. One guy, casually eating a sandwich, told me, "Yeah, HOA said to clear this area for the trail. Something about making it more scenic for residents." I asked, "Did they tell you this was private property?" He shrugged. "They said it belonged to the community." Let that sink in. They said it belonged to the community. Number it belonged to me. My name is on the deed. My grandfather's name was on it before that. I had records, surveys, tax bills, all confirming that the land, including the shoreline, was mine. But apparently, the HOA had decided that since they used the space and their residents looked at it every day, it must be theirs now. I went back home, furious, and pulled out every piece of documentation I could find, the original purchase records, the boundary maps, the title. And sure enough, there it was, the entire shoreline, including the area directly in front of their fancy clubhouse, was private property. My private property. Not leased, not shared, not subject to HOA rules. Period. I consulted a real estate attorney immediately. When she looked at the evidence, she sat back and said, "Oh, wow. They're in big trouble." It turns out what the HOA had done wasn't just illegal, it was outrageously illegal. They had trespassed on private land, demolished a structure without consent, built infrastructure on land they didn't own, and attempted to integrate that land into their community plan without ever consulting the rightful owner. We filed a formal complaint, followed by a cease and desist. The HOA board responded with arrogance, saying they believed the land fell into the community's shared interest space due to proximity and open use. Let me translate that. We thought no one would stop us. Wrong. The lawsuit we filed laid everything out. I wasn't just asking for compensation for the destroyed cabin, though that was part of it. I wanted recognition of my full property rights, and I wanted accountability. When the case went public, everything changed. Local news picked it up. Residents were shocked. Some were furious. Not at me, but at the HOA board for dragging them into a legal storm over what should have been a simple conversation. Their bluff had been called, and as the case unfolded, we discovered more. The HOA had known they didn't own the shoreline. A survey filed 3 years prior, attached to a permit request, clearly marked my land as outside their jurisdiction. They went forward anyway, hoping I either wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight back. Big mistake. The court ruled in my favor. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for the illegal demolition of the cabin, reimburse for land use, cease all construction and remove the trail, and recognize my sole ownership of the disputed shoreline. On top of that, I had the legal right to fence off my entire stretch, including the area directly in front of their clubhouse. I didn't go that far. Instead, I installed signs every 100 feet. Private property. No HOA access, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The trail ends abruptly at my land, blocked by a heavy wooden gate. Behind it, just trees, peace, and the rebuilt version of my grandfather's cabin, upgraded, stronger, and more beautiful than ever. I still visit every weekend. I sit on the porch, watch the sun set over the lake, and sip coffee while HOA residents turn around at the gate and head back the way they came. Sometimes a few bold ones walk up and ask if I'd consider reopening the trail, maybe for a fee. I just smile politely and say, I already gave the HOA one chance to do the right thing. They didn't take it. Now, they can live with the result. At this point, I was furious, but I stayed calm. There's a certain kind of anger that's quiet, cold, calculated. And that's exactly the place I had entered when I got back in my truck and drove home, leaving behind the crushed remains of my grandfather's cabin, my cabin, and the brand new walking trail that ran right through it like it had always belonged to someone else. They thought they could just erase me, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The moment I got home, I went straight for the filing cabinet where I kept all the old documents, title records, land surveys, tax statements. I had everything neatly organized, right where my grandfather left them. It took just 15 minutes to find the most important papers. The land deed, the original survey, a notarized document that clearly mapped the property boundaries down to the square foot. But I didn't stop there. I called my attorney, a no-nonsense real estate lawyer named Karen, who had helped me once before with a zoning issue. When I told her what happened, she said, "Send me everything you've got, right now." I scanned and emailed the documents. A couple hours later, she called me back, and her tone was somewhere between stunned and delighted. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Not only do you own the stretch of shoreline they built that trail on, you own the entire shoreline, from their clubhouse to the main road. It's all yours." That hit me like a thunderbolt. I already knew I had a good chunk of land, but I hadn't realized just how far it extended. The walking trail wasn't just trespassing. It was deep into my property. And then came the bombshell. Karen had pulled up the county's archived maps, compared them to the original property surveys from the 1970s, and overlaid them with the current HOA layout. That's when she saw it. "Their clubhouse," she said slowly, "is partially built on your land. The west wall crosses your boundary line by almost 12 feet. I sat in silence. "They don't know," she continued. "I checked. The HOA's development plans from the early 2000s show a boundary based on a misfiled survey. They built everything, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, and now the trail, under the assumption that the shoreline was public or community-owned, but according to the legal documents, it never was. That meant everything they had constructed over the years sat on land they didn't own. They had no idea. They thought my grandfather's cabin was just some old squatter's shack, something left over from before the neighborhood grew up. A rundown structure on land they assumed no one would fight for. They had no clue it sat on legally owned private property, mine, and that their entire lakeside investment was sitting on a legal time bomb. My attorney's voice sharpened. They're in for a rude awakening. I asked her what I should do next. Well, she said, we'll send them a formal notice first. Give them a chance to settle before we take it to court. But if they dig in their heels, this could turn into a very expensive lesson for them. So we drafted a letter, clear, professional, and backed with a stack of documentation. We demanded immediate cessation of all construction on my land, full compensation for the demolished cabin, compensation for unlawful land use, a formal acknowledgement of my property boundaries, and discussions on the future use, or removal, of their clubhouse structure. We sent the letter directly to the HOA board, certified mail. Then we waited. It didn't take long. Just 3 days later, I got a call from the HOA president, a man named Glenn. I'd never spoken to him before. He was one of those smooth-talking corporate types who treated every conversation like a board meeting. Hey there, he started, all fake cheer. We got your letter. Must be some kind of misunderstanding. The land's been open access for years. We assumed it was part of the community. Assumptions don't change the law, I said calmly. You demolished my property. That's not a misunderstanding. That's trespassing, vandalism, and potentially a felony. He started to push back, trying to downplay the situation. Said the cabin looked abandoned, said the trail was for the good of the community, tried to guilt-trip me. I didn't budge. Finally, when I mentioned the part about their clubhouse being on my land, he got quiet, real quiet. Then came the meetings. The board wanted to resolve things amicably, but they didn't want to admit fault. At first, they offered to pay a modest settlement, just a few $1,000s, and keep the trail in place. I laughed. I reminded them that they were currently using and had built on land that legally belonged to me, that their clubhouse, their tennis courts, and a chunk of their lakeside property were sitting on ground they had no right to. And unless they were prepared to renegotiate every square inch of it, this wasn't going away. That's when they realized I was serious. So we took it to court. The trial was brutal, not because the facts were unclear, but because the HOA had money and they used it to delay, distract, and try to drag me into settlement. But Karen was relentless. She brought every document, every photo, every boundary map. We even brought in a land surveyor to testify, and in the end, the judge ruled in our favor. It was decisive. The HOA was found liable for unlawful demolition of a private structure, trespassing, and unauthorized use of land encroachment by permanent structures, the clubhouse, and damages related to lost value and emotional distress. They were ordered to pay full restitution for the cabin, assessed at nearly $200,000, remove the walking trail and restore the land, pay punitive damages, and, most satisfying of all, renegotiate the use of the clubhouse or face partial demolition. You'd think that would be the end of it. But the best part came later. After the judgment, I had leverage, real leverage. The HOA couldn't function properly without access to their clubhouse, and now they were paying me annual lease fees just to keep it standing. That's right. They now rent their own clubhouse from me. And every year, they cut me a check, just to exist on land they once thought they owned. Oh, and the shoreline? I put up signs. Private property. No trespassing. No community access. Every day I sit on my rebuilt cabin's porch and watch residents walk their dogs up to the fence, look longingly at the water, and turn around. Sometimes they glare at me. Sometimes they wave. Sometimes they pretend I don't exist. But I know they remember. I know they understand. They demolished my past and ended up renting their future from me. We filed a cease and desist immediately. I wasn't going to let this slide. My cabin, the one my grandfather built and I personally restored, was gone. Bulldozed to make way for a walking trail that was never supposed to be there. The HOA didn't ask for permission, didn't send a notice, didn't even try to contact me. They thought I'd be too passive to fight back. They were wrong. The very next day, my attorney and I sent the HOA an official cease and desist letter, along with copies of the property deed, surveys, and a demand for immediate compensation. A few days later, I was invited to an informal meeting at the HOA office, clearly a damage control session. The HOA president, a guy named Glenn, sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by board members who looked more annoyed than concerned. "We understand you're upset," Glenn began condescendingly, "but let's try to be civil. This trail is a benefit to the whole community." I stayed calm. "You mean the trail you built through my private land?" Glenn smiled like I was being unreasonable. "With respect, you have no right to interfere. With community improvements, that area's been open and unused for years." That's when I dropped the bomb. I pulled out the original deed, complete with the signature of the county registrar from 1974. Then the property survey, showing my boundaries, stretching across the entire shoreline and, more importantly, beneath their precious clubhouse. And finally, the permit my grandfather filed for the cabin decades ago. Their smiles disappeared. "You didn't just destroy an old structure," I said. "You trespassed, you destroyed private property, you illegally developed on my land. And your clubhouse, your center of operations, is sitting on property that doesn't belong to you." Silence. Dead silence. One board member coughed. Another tried to mutter something about long-standing community use, but I shut that down quickly. "You never owned this land," I said. "You assumed, you didn't check, and now it's going to cost you." That's when panic turned to denial, then bargaining. They offered me a few $1,000s to cover the structure loss and proposed a trail easement agreement. Basically, they wanted to legalize their path retroactively. I laughed. "A few thousand?" I repeated. "You demolished a historic cabin, encroached on over 200 feet of my shoreline, and built part of your clubhouse on my property. You don't get to buy your way out with pocket change." They didn't respond well. Their lawyer reached out, trying to push the mutual benefit angle. Said the trail increased property values for everyone. Said they were prepared to defend the community's interests. Fine. If they wanted a legal fight, they were going to get one. With my attorney's help, we filed a lawsuit, not just for the destruction of the cabin, but for trespassing illegal land use, unlawful demolition of private property, loss of historical value, and partial eviction of all structures built on my land, including the clubhouse. Once the lawsuit hit, the HOA's tone changed. Suddenly, the board meetings turned frantic. Emails leaked. I received copies from sympathetic homeowners, showing that Glenn and several others knew the boundary line was murky, but proceeded anyway. One even wrote, "What's he going to do about it? It's an old shack." That email became Exhibit A in court. The trial lasted several weeks. The HOA tried every trick. They brought in surveyors with adjusted maps, tried to claim adverse possession, and even accused me of abandoning the property. But we had documentation. Original records, continuous tax payments, permits, photos. The judge saw through their excuses. And the ruling? Absolutely devastating. For them. Here's what the court ordered. Full compensation for the demolished cabin valued at over $180,000, plus an additional $50,000 for emotional distress and historical value. Immediate. Removal of the walking trail and restoration of my land within 30 days. A cease on all HOA development until all boundaries were legally clarified. And the kicker. An injunction against the continued use of the portion of the clubhouse built on my Land unless they paid me to lease it, that's right. I now had the legal right to shut down their clubhouse. The HOA tried to appeal, but they lost again. Eventually, they came back with a very different attitude. Gone was the smug tone. Gone was the dismissiveness. Now they were desperate. They offered to pay a yearly lease for the land under the clubhouse, a 6-figure annual fee just to avoid tearing down their own building. They even offered to fund the full reconstruction of my cabin as a gesture of goodwill. This time, I negotiated. In the end, here's what I walked away with: a brand new cabin, fully funded by the HOA's insurance, 6 years of backdated rent for their unauthorized use of my Land A binding lease agreement, requiring them to pay me $10,000 a month to keep their Clubhouse A signed public apology to be distributed to all homeowners, and, my favorite part, exclusive control of the shoreline, with clear legal signage banning all HOA use without prior written permission. I built a new dock, put up fences, and every summer I sit on my porch watching HOA members walk down to the trail entrance, only to hit a locked gate with a shiny plaque that reads, "Private property, no trespassing, trespassers will be prosecuted." Some glare at me, some look embarrassed, some just turn around and walk away. And Glenn? He resigned from the board 6 months after the judgment. Word is, he still lives in the neighborhood, but rarely shows his face at HOA events anymore. Funny how that works. You know, my grandfather once told me something I didn't fully understand until all this happened. Land, he said, is the only thing they'll fight you for without even knowing why. Because they think it's theirs, just because they want it to be. Well, this time, wanting it wasn't enough. They thought they could steamroll me. They thought I'd fold. But they didn't realize I wasn't just defending a cabin, I was defending a legacy. And now every check they send me each month is a reminder of just how badly they miscalculated. The court sided with me. After months of legal back and forth, tense depositions and stacks of paperwork proving what should have been obvious from the start, the judge made it crystal clear. I was the rightful landowner. The HOA had trespassed, destroyed private property, and constructed illegal developments on land that didn't belong to them. And the punishment? Swift and satisfying. The HOA was ordered to pay for the full value of my demolished cabin, estimated at $180,000 based on local real estate comparisons and historical preservation assessments. On top of that, they were slapped with additional penalties, $70,000 in damages for emotional distress and land restoration, legal fees, and, the kicker, a 30-day deadline to either tear down any structures encroaching on my land or negotiate a lease on my terms. Let's just say that part caused a few emergency meetings in the HOA boardroom. They had a choice: either bulldoze part of their beloved clubhouse, the heart of their community gatherings, HOA elections, and high-end events, or sign a lease and start paying me monthly. Guess what they chose? That's right. They signed the lease. And now, every single month, they pay me $12,000 just to keep using their clubhouse. Let me say that again. They pay me $12,000 every single month. And as part of the settlement, they were also required to publicly acknowledge their mistake. That meant a letter went out to every resident of the HOA neighborhood, signed by the board, apologizing for their actions, detailing their trespass, and explaining the legal outcome. I still have a copy framed on the wall of my new cabin. Oh, and the scenic lakeside trail they worked so hard on. It now comes to a sudden and awkward stop at the edge of my property. Right there at the border, I installed a large, hand-carved wooden sign. It reads, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." To add a bit of flair, I added a smaller sign beneath it. "Yes, we mean you, the owner." People who walk the trail often pause at the edge, stare at the sign, and turn back. Every now and then, someone grumbles about how unfair it is. But rules are rules, and now they know how it feels to have boundaries enforced. Let me take you back a bit, because I think this part is important. When I first pulled up to my land and saw my cabin in ruins, I felt completely powerless. I remember just standing there, stunned, with sawdust still fresh in the air and a gaping hole where my front porch used to be. It was like a punch to the chest. I had spent 2 full summers restoring that cabin, hauling lumber, fixing beams, sanding floors. It wasn't just a structure, it was my family's history, my grandfather's gift, a place of peace and solitude. And they didn't even bother to call me. They just knocked it down like it was some old tool shed cluttering up their view. But here's the thing. That moment of devastation turned into fuel. I wasn't going to let this HOA, this entitled, overreaching board of suburban tyrants, walk all over me. They assumed I was weak. They assumed I didn't matter. Big mistake, because I had something more powerful than their arrogance. Proof of ownership, a good attorney, and a lot of patience. The courtroom days were surreal. I remember sitting there as their lawyer tried to argue that the cabin wasn't structurally sound, and that the community had a reasonable belief it was abandoned. The judge didn't buy it, especially not after I showed time-stamped photos, tax payment history, and a logbook of repairs I had documented over the years. And when I presented the county survey showing the clubhouse was partially built on my land, you could hear a pin drop. The HOA president, Glenn, visibly turned pale. It was obvious they never bothered to double-check boundaries before building. They just assumed, and assumptions are dangerous in real estate. After the ruling, Glenn tried to save face. He offered me a generous settlement, basically hush money to make it go away quietly. But I wasn't interested in sweeping this under the rug. I wanted accountability, and more importantly, I wanted to make sure this never happened again, to me or anyone else. So what's life like now? Honestly, peaceful. And a little poetic. I rebuilt the cabin, this time with better insulation, a full wraparound porch and solar panels, and thanks to the HOA's monthly lease checks, I've got a steady stream of passive income that more than covers the costs. I even added a little dock, just for fishing, kayaking, or sitting with a cup of coffee while watching the sunrise. But the best part? The clubhouse, the crown jewel of the HOA, literally cannot function without me. Every month, like clockwork, they send that lease check. Every event, every wine night, every community vote, it all happens in a building that rests on land they don't own. Sometimes I walk past the trailhead just to see people stop at the sign. Some of them glance toward my property, wondering who I am. A few probably curse me under their breath. Let them. Because here's what they don't. Understand, I never wanted any of this drama. I never wanted to go to court. I never wanted a legal fight or lease payments or fences. All I wanted was to be left alone. To enjoy the cabin my grandfather built. To walk the woods, fish the lake, and maybe one day pass the property on to someone I love. But the HOA couldn't help themselves. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs. They thought they could silence me, steamroll me, or, worst of all, ignore me. And that's the lesson here. Don't mess with the quiet guy who knows what he owns. We may not shout. We may not show up to your meetings. We may not fight every little battle. But when the time comes, we know where the line is, and we'll defend it, brick by brick, deed by deed, law by law. So the next time an HOA gets a little too confident, they might want to double-check their boundaries, because not every cabin is just a shack. Some are legacies, and some legacies, like mine, come with a paper trail, a lawyer on speed dial, and a really sharp no trespassing sign. If you think HOAs have too much power, hit that like button and subscribe for more crazy real estate stories. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done if this happened to you?